I always thought I knew my best friend's wife, until the day I caught her sneaking out of a stranger's house at dawn. My name is Tom, and I never imagined I'd find myself entangled in someone else's marital drama, let alone my best friend's. We've all heard stories of infidelity, those whispers that circulate among friends and family, but you never really expect to be a part of one. Yet, here I am, recounting the events that turned my world, and my best friends, upside down. I've known Jack for as long as I can remember. We grew up together, went to the same schools, and even ended up working in the same industry, though at different companies. We were more like brothers than friends. So naturally, when he met and married Sarah, she became like a sister to me. Sarah was everything Jack had ever wanted. Beautiful, intelligent, and charming. They seemed perfect together, the kind of couple that others envied. Our lives were busy, but we always made time for each other. Jack and Sarah would often host dinner parties, and I'd find myself at their house nearly every weekend. We'd laugh, share stories, and just enjoy each other's company. I'd always admired how effortlessly they seemed to complement each other, finishing each other's sentences, and sharing those little inside jokes that only couples who are truly in sync seem to have. But then, things started to change. It was subtle at first. Sarah seemed a bit more distant, less engaged in our conversations. She started missing out on our usual gatherings, claiming she had work or other commitments. Jack didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't mention it. I figured it was just the ebb and flow of a long-term relationship, and I didn't think much of it. That was until the morning I saw her. It was a Saturday, early. Too early for anyone to be out and about, unless they had a reason. I was driving back home after an early morning run when I saw Sarah stepping out of a house on the other side of town. It wasn't their house, nor was it anyone's house that I recognized. She was wearing clothes I didn't usually see her in, more casual, almost thrown together, and she looked around nervously before hurrying to her car. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe she was visiting a friend or there was some kind of emergency, but something didn't sit right with me. The look on her face, the way she moved, it all seemed wrong. I decided not to mention it to Jack. After all, I didn't have any concrete evidence, and the last thing I wanted was to stir up trouble based on a hunch. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying more attention to Sarah's behavior. She was increasingly absent from our gatherings, always with a different excuse. Jack seemed more stressed, more distracted, but he still didn't say anything. I could see the strain in his eyes, though he tried to hide it behind his usual jovial demeanor. One evening, Jack and I went out for drinks, something we hadn't done in a while. I could tell he needed to talk, but I wasn't sure how to bring up what I'd seen. We were a few beers in when he finally opened up. He told me that things hadn't been the same between him and Sarah for months. She was distant, cold even, and he didn't know why. He tried to talk to her about it, but she always brushed him off, saying she was just tired or stressed from work. I wanted to tell him what I'd seen, but I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if there was a perfectly innocent explanation? But I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I told him about the morning I saw Sarah leaving that house, how out of place she seemed. Jack's face went pale as I spoke, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. He thanked me for telling him, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. We didn't talk much after that, just sat there in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew I had done the right thing, but it didn't make me feel any better. I felt like I had just dropped a bomb on my best friend's life, and there was no way to undo it. A few days later, Jack called me. His voice was shaky, a mix of anger and despair. He had confronted Sarah, and after a lot of back and forth, she finally admitted to the affair. She had been seeing someone else for nearly a year, someone she had met at work. The house I saw her leaving that morning belonged to him. Jack was devastated, and I felt a pang of guilt, wondering if I could have prevented this if I had spoken up sooner. The fallout was brutal. Jack moved out of their house and into a small apartment across town. He filed for divorce, and the process was messy, as these things often are. Friends and family took sides, and the once perfect couple became a cautionary tale. I tried to be there for Jack as much as I could, but I knew that nothing I said or did could make it better. Sarah tried to reach out to me a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to her. She wasn't the person I thought she was, and I didn't know how to reconcile the Sarah I knew with the one who had betrayed my best friend. It was like she had become a stranger overnight. In the months that followed, Jack slowly began to rebuild his life. He threw himself into work, picking up new hobbies and reconnecting with old friends. But the scars were still there, just beneath the surface. He was a different person, quieter, more guarded. The easygoing, carefree Jack I had known for so long was gone, replaced by someone who had been through hell and was still trying to find his way back. As for Sarah, she moved on with her life as well, though I heard through the grapevine that her relationship with the other man didn't last. The last I heard, she had moved out of town, trying to start fresh somewhere new. I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her, though I knew that infidelity was rarely as black and white as it seemed. 6 months later, time passed, and life started to settle into a new rhythm. Jack and I didn't hang out as often as we used to, partly because he was still healing, and partly because I could sense that my involvement in the whole ordeal, however necessary, had created a small but noticeable rift between us. We were still close, but something had changed. I think Jack associated me with the worst period of his life, even if he never said it out loud. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from Sarah. I hadn't spoken to her since the divorce was finalized. I was surprised to see her name on my phone screen, and for a moment, I debated whether to answer. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. "Tom, it's Sarah. Can we talk?" Her voice was soft, almost pleading. There was a vulnerability in it that I hadn't heard before. "What is it, Sarah?" I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. I just wanted to apologize," she said. "I know I've hurt a lot of people, and I've been doing a lot of thinking. I need to talk to someone who knows what happened, who knows me." I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to hang up, to tell her that there was nothing left to say. But another part of me was curious. Curious about what she could possibly have to say now, after everything that had happened. "Okay," I said after a long pause. "Let's meet at the cafe downtown." When I arrived, Sarah was already there, sitting at a table by the window, staring out at the street. She looked different, tired, worn down, as if the past year had aged her. She smiled weakly when she saw me and gestured for me to sit. "Thanks for meeting me," she said as I sat down. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed to talk to someone who knew Jack, who knew us." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I messed up," she began, her voice trembling. "I know that now. I knew it then too, but I didn't want to admit it. The affair, it wasn't about the other man, not really. It was about me. I felt trapped, like I was suffocating. Jack is a great guy, and he didn't deserve what I did to him, but I wasn't happy, and I didn't know how to fix it. So, I ran away from it, into something that felt exciting, new, different." I listened quietly as she spoke, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one who had betrayed my best friend. She seemed genuinely remorseful, but it was hard to forget the pain she had caused. "I've been seeing a therapist," she continued, "trying to figure out why I did what I did and how to move forward. I lost everything, Tom. My marriage, my friends, my self-respect. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say this. To you, to Jack, to anyone who would listen." I didn't know what to say. I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sympathy, confusion. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her that it was okay to make mistakes, that we all do at some point. But another part of me couldn't get past the hurt she had caused, not just to Jack, but to everyone who cared about them as a couple. "Sarah, I appreciate you reaching out," I finally said, choosing my words carefully. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you've done wrong, but you have to understand, what you did, it's not something that just goes away. Jack is still hurting, and I don't know if he'll ever fully recover from it." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know, she whispered. I don't expect him to. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better, to be someone who doesn't hurt people like that ever again. We sat in silence for a while after that, both lost in our thoughts. Finally, Sarah stood up. Thank you, Tom, for listening. I don't know if this changes anything, but I needed to say it. Take care of yourself, Sarah, I said as she walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. A year later, life has a funny way of moving on, even when it feels like it never will. Jack and I drifted apart somewhat, though we still kept in touch. He moved to a new city, got a new job, and even started dating again. He wasn't the same person he used to be, but he was healing, slowly but surely. As for me, I found myself thinking about Sarah's words more often than I expected. It was strange, but I realized that in some ways, I had learned from her mistakes. I became more mindful of my own relationships, more aware of how easily things can fall apart if you're not careful. I wasn't married, but I had been in a serious relationship for a few years, and I made it a point to communicate more openly, to address issues before they had a chance to fester. Jack and I eventually reconnected, though it was never quite the same as before. We had both changed, and the shadow of what had happened between him and Sarah lingered over our friendship. But we made an effort to rebuild, to find a new normal, and that was enough. I never saw Sarah again after that day at the cafe. I heard through mutual friends that she had moved away, started over in a new city where no one knew her story. I hope she found the peace she was looking for, though I couldn't say I ever fully forgave her for what she had done. Looking back, I realized that this whole experience had taught me a lot, not just about relationships, but about life in general. I learned that people are complicated, that good people can make bad choices, and that forgiveness isn't always easy or even possible. But I also learned that life goes on, that we can find new ways to move forward even after the worst betrayals. In the end, I think the most important lesson I learned was this: trust is fragile. It's something that takes years to build and only moments to destroy. And once it's gone, it's almost impossible to get back. But if we're lucky, we can learn from our mistakes, pick up the pieces, and try to do better next time. That's all any of us can really hope for. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Jack began to rebuild his life. He threw himself into his work, and soon enough, he started to make new friends in the city where he had relocated. I visited him a few times, and it was clear that the change of scenery had done him some good. He was still quieter, more reserved than he used to be, but there was a resilience in him that hadn't been there before. We had many conversations during those visits, about life, love, and everything in between. Jack had gained a perspective that he might never have had if he hadn't gone through such a painful experience. He told me once, over a couple of beers on his new balcony, that he didn't think he would ever fully trust someone again, but he was okay with that. He had come to terms with the fact that some wounds leave scars, and those scars become a part of who you are. Sarah, meanwhile, remained a distant memory. I occasionally heard snippets about her through mutual friends, how she had moved out west, was working in a new job, and was trying to start over. It seemed like she had truly taken her time to reflect and grow. But by then, any chance of reconciliation with Jack, or even with me, was long gone. She had become a ghost from the past, a reminder of a chapter in our lives that we were all trying to move on from. As time passed, the story of Jack and Sarah became something of a cautionary tale among our circle of friends. It was the kind of story people whispered about, shaking their heads at how things could go so wrong in what seemed like such a perfect relationship. It was a reminder that life is unpredictable, that even the most seemingly solid foundations can crumble if you're not careful. But it was also a story of survival, of picking up the pieces and moving forward. Jack's journey was one of resilience, of refusing to let betrayal define him. He wasn't the same person he had been before, but in some ways, he was stronger. He had learned to value himself, to not settle for less than he deserved, and that was something I deeply admired about him. In the end, the events of that year left an indelible mark on all of us. They changed the way we viewed relationships, the way we approached trust and vulnerability. But they also taught us the importance of honesty, of facing the truth head-on, even when it's painful. As for me, I continued to live my life with those lessons in mind. I became more mindful of my own relationships, more aware of the need for communication and transparency. I made sure to never take the people in my life for granted, knowing how easily everything can fall apart if you're not careful. Life went on, as it always does. Jack eventually met someone new, someone who understood his past and was willing to build a future with him despite it. I was happy for him, though I knew he would never fully forget what had happened. But that was okay. The past is a part of us, but it doesn't have to define us. We can learn from it, grow from it, and use those experiences to shape the people we become. And so, the story of Jack and Sarah faded into the background, becoming just another chapter in the book of our lives. It was a painful chapter, to be sure, but one that taught us more than we ever expected to learn. And for that, in some strange way, I was grateful, because in the end, we were all stronger, wiser, and more resilient because of it. As I sit here, reflecting on everything that happened, I realize that life is full of unexpected twists and turns. We never know what's going to happen next, but we do know that we have the strength to get through it, no matter how difficult it may seem. And that's something worth holding on to, because in the end, it's not the betrayals that define us, it's how we choose to move forward that truly matters. The last thing I expected when visiting my cousin for the holidays was to discover that his perfect marriage was nothing but a facade. My name is Mark, and I've always been close to my cousin Jeff. Growing up, we spent every summer together, getting into all sorts of mischief, and as we got older, that bond never really faded. Jeff was like a brother to me, and I was thrilled when he met Lisa. She was everything you could want in a partner: kind, smart, and down to earth. They were the kind of couple you'd see in a movie, the ones who seemed to have it all figured out. I had moved across the country for work, so I didn't get to see Jeff and Lisa as much as I would have liked. But we kept in touch, and every time we did talk, Jeff would rave about how happy they were, how great everything was. So, when I got an invite to spend Christmas with them, I jumped at the chance. I arrived at their house just a few days before Christmas. It was like stepping into a holiday postcard: snow-covered lawn, lights twinkling on the trees, and the smell of freshly baked cookies wafting through the air. Lisa greeted me with a warm hug, and Jeff was his usual cheerful self. Everything seemed perfect, just like I imagined it would be. But as the days went on, I started to notice things. Small things at first. Lisa seemed distant, distracted, almost like she wasn't fully present. Jeff, on the other hand, was overcompensating, trying too hard to make everything seem perfect. He was constantly checking on Lisa, asking if she was okay, if she needed anything. It was subtle, but the more I watched, the more I realized that something wasn't right. It all came to a head on Christmas Eve. We had just finished dinner, and Jeff was in the kitchen cleaning up while Lisa and I sat by the fire. She was quiet, staring into the flames, and I could tell something was bothering her. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but before I could make up my mind, Lisa turned to me. "Mark, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice soft and unsure. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Do you ever feel like you're living a life that isn't yours? Like you're just going through the motions, pretending to be someone you're not?" Her question caught me off guard. I wasn't sure where she was going with this, but I could sense that this was about more than just idle conversation. "Sometimes, I guess," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But usually it's a sign that something needs to change." Lisa nodded, her eyes still fixed on the fire. "I feel like I'm suffocating, Mark. I love Jeff. I really do. But this life, it's not what I wanted. I'm not the person he thinks I am." I was stunned. This was the first time I had ever heard Lisa talk like this, and I didn't know what to say. Before I could respond, Jeff walked in, smiling as if nothing was wrong. Lisa quickly composed herself, but the tension in the room was palpable. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lisa's words kept replaying in my mind. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront Jeff, or should I just pretend I hadn't heard anything? The next morning, everything seemed back to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Christmas Day was a blur of presents, food, and laughter, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't ignore. Lisa was trying her best to keep up appearances, but I could see the cracks in the facade. Jeff, on the other hand, seemed oblivious, or maybe he just didn't want to see it. It wasn't until the day after Christmas that the truth finally came out. Jeff had gone out to run some errands, leaving Lisa and me alone in the house. I was in the living room, flipping through a magazine when Lisa walked in, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. "What's going on, Lisa?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I've been seeing someone else, Mark. For months now. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it just did. I'm not in love with Jeff anymore, and I don't know how to tell him. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. This wasn't what I had expected at all. Jeff was my cousin, my best friend, and the thought of him finding out that his wife was cheating on him was more than I could bear." "Lisa, you have to tell him," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He deserves to know the truth." "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I'm so scared, Mark. I don't want to hurt him, but I can't keep living this lie." At that moment, I heard the front door open. Jeff was back. Lisa quickly wiped her eyes and tried to pull herself together, but it was too late. Jeff walked in, and the look on his face told me that he knew something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Lisa looked at me, and I knew she was silently pleading for help, but there was nothing I could do. This was a conversation they needed to have. "Jeff, we need to talk," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeff's face went pale, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "What's going on, Lisa? You're scaring me." I've been unfaithful, Jeff," she said, her voice cracking. "I've been seeing someone else, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you, but I can't lie to you anymore." For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, Jeff let out a strangled gasp, as if he had been punched in the gut. He looked at Lisa, then at me, and I could see the pain and betrayal in his eyes. "Mark, did you know about this?" he asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head. "I only found out today, Jeff. I'm so sorry." Jeff didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood there, staring at Lisa, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Finally, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Lisa and me alone in the deafening silence. The days that followed were some of the hardest I've ever experienced. Jeff moved out of the house and went to stay with a friend, and I stayed with Lisa, trying to help her through the aftermath of her confession. She was a wreck, full of guilt and regret, but there was nothing I could do to make it better. Over the next few weeks, the fallout from Lisa's confession consumed all our lives. Jeff refused to speak to her, cutting off all contact. He wouldn't return her calls or texts, and he avoided any place where he might run into her. It was like he had disappeared off the face of the earth, and Lisa was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered life alone. Lisa spent her days in a daze, barely functioning. She stopped going to work, shut herself off from her friends, and spent most of her time curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the television. I tried to encourage her to go out, to do something, anything, but it was like she had given up. The guilt was eating her alive, and no matter how much I tried to comfort her, nothing seemed to help. One night, about a month after the confession, Lisa broke down completely. She was sitting in the darkened living room, a bottle of wine in one hand and a half-empty glass in the other. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her hair was a tangled mess. "Mark, I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't live with myself knowing what I've done. I've destroyed everything, and I don't know how to fix it." I knelt down in front of her, taking the glass from her hand. "Lisa, you made a mistake, but that doesn't mean your life is over. You need to forgive yourself and start over. You can't change the past, but you can decide what you want your future to be." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't deserve a future, Mark. I deserve to be alone, to suffer for what I've done." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to help her, to make her see that she could still have a life after this. But the truth was, I wasn't sure she could. She had hurt Jeff deeply, and in doing so, she had also hurt herself. The person she had been was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. As the months went by, things only got worse. Jeff filed for divorce, and the process was as painful and ugly as you might expect. He wanted nothing to do with Lisa, refusing any attempts at reconciliation or even a civil conversation. It was clear that he was done with her, and no amount of apologies or explanations would change that. Lisa spiraled further into depression. She lost her job, stopped taking care of herself, and began drinking more heavily. I tried to be there for her, but it was like trying to hold on to a sinking ship. Every time I thought she was starting to come around, something would happen to pull her back into the darkness. One day, I received a call from Jeff. It was the first time he had reached out to me since the night Lisa confessed. His voice was calm, but there was a coldness to it that made my stomach turn. "Mark, I just wanted to let you know that I'm moving back to our hometown. I've put the house on the market, and I'll be out by the end of the month." I was taken aback. "Jeff, are you sure? I mean, that's a big decision." "I'm sure," he said firmly. "There's nothing left for me here, Mark. I need to start over, and I can't do that while I'm surrounded by memories of her." I understood, but it still hurt to hear. Jeff was more than just my cousin. He was one of my closest friends. The thought of him leaving and putting even more distance between us was difficult to accept. "What about Lisa?" I asked, even though I knew it was a touchy subject. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't care what she does," he finally said. "She made her choices, and now she has to live with the consequences. I'm done." That was the last time I spoke to Jeff before he moved. True to his word, he packed up his things and left without saying goodbye to anyone. The house was sold within weeks, and Lisa was forced to find a new place to live. Lisa's new apartment was a far cry from the home she had shared with Jeff. It was small, cramped, and in a much rougher part of town. But it was all she could afford, given her financial situation. The divorce had drained her savings, and without a job, she was barely scraping by. I visited her as often as I could, but each time, it seemed like she was slipping further away. The apartment was always a mess, with dirty dishes piled up in the sink and empty wine bottles scattered around. Lisa herself looked worse with each visit, pale, gaunt, and lifeless. One evening, I found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by old photographs of her and Jeff. She was holding a picture of them on their wedding day, her fingers tracing the outline of his face. "I was so happy that day," she whispered, not looking up at me. "I really thought we were going to spend the rest of our lives together." I sat down next to her, unsure of what to say. "Lisa, you can't keep torturing yourself like this. It's not healthy." She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "I don't know how to stop, Mark. I don't know how to move on. He was everything to me, and now he's gone. I've lost him, and I've lost myself." It broke my heart to see her like this. The strong, vibrant woman I once knew was gone, replaced by someone who was barely hanging on. As the years passed, Jeff and I stayed in touch, though our conversations were few and far between. He eventually remarried, and from what I could tell, he seemed happy. His new wife, Claire, was kind and understanding, and she helped him heal from the wounds of his past. They had a child together, a little girl named Emma, and for the first time in a long time, Jeff seemed genuinely at peace. Lisa, on the other hand, never fully recovered. She managed to find a part-time job at a local diner, but it was clear that her heart wasn't in it. She lived day to day, going through the motions of life without any real sense of purpose. Her drinking became worse, and no matter how much I tried to intervene, she pushed me away. One day, I received a call from her landlord. He had found her unconscious in her apartment, surrounded by empty bottles. She had been taken to the hospital, where she was being treated for alcohol poisoning. I rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding in my chest, fearing the worst. When I arrived, Lisa was still unconscious. The doctors told me that she was in critical condition and that it was touch and go. I sat by her bedside for hours, watching the rise and fall of her chest, praying that she would pull through. Miraculously, Lisa survived, but it was a wake-up call for both of us. She agreed to go to rehab, and I promised to support her every step of the way. It wasn't an easy journey. There were relapses, setbacks, and moments of despair. But slowly, she began to rebuild her life. Years later, Lisa is a different person. She's sober, working full-time, and has even started volunteering at a local shelter. She's not the same woman she was before the affair, but in many ways, she's stronger. She's learned to forgive herself and to accept that while the past can't be changed, the future is still unwritten. As for Jeff, we've reconnected in a way that I never thought possible. He's happy with his new life, and while the scars of what happened will always be there, he's found a way to move on. We've both learned that forgiveness of others and of ourselves is the key to healing. Looking back, I realized that this experience taught me a lot about love, betrayal, and the complexities of human relationships. It was a painful lesson, one that none of us will ever forget, but it was also a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. Because in the end, life is about more than just the mistakes we make. It's about how we choose to move forward, how we find the strength to forgive, and how we rebuild our lives from the ashes of the past. And so, the story of Jeff and Lisa became just another chapter in the book of our lives. A chapter filled with heartache, regret, and ultimately, redemption. Because in the end, it's not the mistakes we make that define us. It's how we rise from them that truly matters. This story represents a journey from the depths of despair to the hope of new beginnings. It's a reminder that no matter how far we fall, there is always a way back, even if the road is long and fraught with challenges. In the end, it's the strength of the human spirit, the capacity for forgiveness, and the willingness to rebuild that define us.